Much of the social history of the Western world over the past 3 decades has involved replacing what worked with what sounded good. In area after area crime, education, housing, race relations, moral value standards that had evolved over centuries of experience have been replaced by new ideas. Brilliant in form, seductive in promise, and disastrous in result. The anointed tell us that we must care, that we must try something new, that we must not be bound by the past. But what they refuse to recognize is that the past has produced more knowledge than any single generation could ever hope to create. The real question is not whether we care, but whether we are willing to learn from the wisdom and the pain of those who came before us. It is not whether we feel compassion, but whether we exercise judgment.
Thomas Sowell's words cut through the moral vanity of modern intellectual life with surgical precision. He indicts an era not for malice, but for hubris, for believing that compassion and novelty are substitutes for wisdom and discipline. His statement is not nostalgia for some imagined golden age. It's an empirical reminder that social systems, like ecosystems, evolve through painful trial and error. The standards that had evolved over centuries of experience, as Sowell puts it, were not arbitrary. They were the residue of civilization's long experiment with itself. To discard them wholesale is not progress, but amnesia. Sowell's insight is anchored in his belief that human nature is stubbornly constant. The same impulses that produced both civilization and catastrophe in earlier ages still pulse through modern institutions. The anointed, his term for the self-satisfied intellectual elite, imagine that moral intent alone can transform human behavior. But history, in Sowell's view, is the record of limits. Limits on what governments can engineer, what cultures can ignore, and what compassion can accomplish without structure. When we trade the tested for the fashionable, we sever ourselves from that memory of limits, mistaking emotion for evidence and novelty for improvement. The line about the past containing more knowledge than any single generation could ever hope to create is especially striking. Sowell's conservatism here is not political, but epistemological, a recognition that civilization itself is a collective intelligence, far older and wiser than any of its parts. Each generation inherits a vast accumulation of insight encoded in customs, moral codes, economic arrangements, and even taboos. To dismiss these as outdated is to commit an act of intellectual vandalism. It is an arrogance peculiar to an age of mass education, one that confuses information with wisdom, opinion with understanding, and progress with perpetual reinvention. Sowell contrasts the virtue of caring with the virtue of judgment. Caring, in his formulation, is passive, performative, and cheap. It requires no cost, no study, no responsibility for consequences. Judgment, by contrast, is earned, demands knowledge of human nature, willingness to look at results rather than intentions, and the humility to admit that civilization is built upon the bones of failed experiments. In every generation, he implies, there are those who wish to sweep away the old foundations in order to build a perfect moral order. But Sowell, an economist by training and a realist by temperament, reminds us that human societies are complex, adaptive systems, not machines to be rebuilt according to fashion. At its core, this passage is less about politics and more about the fragility of accumulated wisdom. Sowell saw how entire civilizations can regress not because of tyranny or ignorance, but because of moral impatience, the desire to do good faster than reality allows. In his eyes, progress depends not on novelty, but on gratitude. Gratitude for the imperfect but functioning institutions handed down to us. Gratitude for the invisible scaffolding of norms and habits that keep chaos at bay. When those are replaced by slogans and sentiment, we get what he calls disastrous results, a world governed by feelings untethered from facts. Sowell's warning is timeless, that moral fervor without humility becomes destruction disguised as compassion. The lesson is not that we must never change, but that we must change with memory, with reverence for the costly lessons that the past already paid for in full.